Good morning, and welcome to this special briefing with New York City Comptroller Brad Lander. We're excited to have Brad here at ABNY for the first time. And while we haven't yet had the Comptroller as our guest speaker, we all certainly know him for his well-earned reputation as a major policymaker in the council, where for 12 years he represented Brownstone, Brooklyn. Before elected office, the Comptroller cut his teeth on housing and land use issues, having led both the Pratt Center and Park Slopes Fifth Avenue Committee. We're grateful that he's taking the time with us today to talk to us about his priorities for the future. As a trustee of the city's 5 public pension funds that manage more than $250 billion in assets, he has a critical role as the steward of retirement funds essential to our hardworking municipal labor force. At the same time, he's the principal watchdog on the city's now $100 billion budget, a job that just got tougher as the mayor announced significant budget cuts over the next few years, and a sign that the one-time boost of federal funds that came in from pandemic recovery and our economic recovery isn't nearly as strong as we had all hoped. It's a complicated time. The city remains 176,000 jobs below our pre-pandemic peak. We're starting to see layoffs in the financial and the tech sectors, and worries over inflation, the markets, and a recession continue to mount. At the same time, this past week, our subway system hit pre-pandemic levels for the first time. And so there are good signs and bad signs, but it's complicated and it's hard to know what's ahead. So it's no surprise there's a lot of anxiety out there among business leaders, major employers, as well as small businesses and not-for-profits that are very real. We're so glad to see our Comptroller working with the council to set aside a record amount of rainy day funds in the current budget. And say a few things that he's done since taking office. He's used audits to shape policy, like pushing the EDC to revamp its popular New York City ferry service to become more fiscally sustainable by raising ticket prices and competitively bidding out contracts. As all those one-time pandemic rescue funds from DC dry up, and as new infrastructure money comes in, it falls on our Comptroller to make sure we don't squander public dollars that may never come again. We are really grateful to have him here today to join our ABNY community. We're excited to hear from him. I know we'll all have a lot of questions. So the webinar over to you, Comptroller. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thanks to you and Melba for inviting me, and to the whole ABNY community. We're lucky to have this community of people deeply committed, to being here, to creating value, to thinking about the civic and economic life of the city, and to doing it in partnership. So I'm honored to be here for the first time as Comptroller and really grateful for the platform. I'm excited to be here today to talk to you about the future of New York City's economy. Before I get started, I want to celebrate one great win we had this week, working together with Attorney General Tish James and with Amalgamated Bank and others. The New York City pension funds won a campaign to get the credit card companies, MasterCard, Visa, and American Express, to implement what's called a merchant category code. Something that already exists across most retailers, bike shops, nail salons, grocery stores. Almost every retailer has a merchant category code. But until this week, one did not exist for gun and ammunition stores. And now it will exist, and it will help financial institutions flag suspicious activities to law enforcement. We believe it's got the potential to save lives. Ahead of the Pulse nightclub mass shooting in 2016, that gunman bought over $26,000 in guns and ammunition from a number of independent gun stores using a credit card. They were all just coded as miscellaneous or general purchases. And now that is going to change. The credit card companies had previously opposed this step, fearing backlash from the NRA. Our role, the New York City pension funds, as large investors in MasterCard, Visa, and American Express, was filing shareholder resolutions to help to change that. And as a result of that and other organizing, the code is now created and is going to go into effect. And to me, it's a great example of thoughtful fiduciary investing. This is going to save lives, and it's also going to help those credit card companies better reduce and manage their liability and risk. So it makes sense from both a financial and a moral perspective. And I'm not going to focus too much today on the pension funds and investment strategy. I'm actually happy to talk about that in response to questions if you have them, but I want to focus a little more on the city's economy and what kind of city government we need for this uncertain moment that Stephen rightly described. But I wanted to start there in part just because I'm excited about a good win this week, but in part because I believe a similar approach makes sense more broadly. I want to make the case to you today that what will help New York City's economy flourish through these uncertain times is a real action that will also make it more inclusive, and that what we need from the public sector is both a dedicated focus on making city government work better and budget wisely, and a more ambitious vision for how city government delivers the services and supports that help more New Yorkers to thrive, and that aims to make New York City the capital of inclusive multiracial democracy in the decades ahead. Those things are hard to do, but I submit they are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they're mutually essential. So to begin, I'd like to ask you to join me in thinking back for just a minute to the scary days toward the beginning of the pandemic, when there was significant anxiety about the future of New York City and its economy. You know, Stephen rightly mentioned that we faced some challenges, but I think it's important to just remember back that at that moment, it was reasonable to wonder, as a result of COVID-19, would people want to live and work in dense places like New York City? Would they ride the subway? Would they work from offices at all? Would they want to live in multifamily housing? Would they want to pay New York City rents when they could work remotely from anywhere in the country? I think that there were a set of people thinking, just like in the 1970s, when manufacturing left the city and it was hard to see the city's thriving future. With New York City, what would it look like on the other side of the pandemic? And for all the challenges we face, I think it's important to recognize there is very good reason to believe that the future New York City is looking at is far more robust, far rosier than we in those very dark moments feared. That's not to deny the challenges, which I'll come back to, but I'm going to say maybe the positive side of some of the negatives that that Stephen was lifting up, because it's true we're still down those jobs, but as of July, we've regained 96% of the private sector jobs that we had before the pandemic. And while some important sectors like leisure and hospitality have been slow to recover and are even more than 4% down, other sectors, really critical ones like tech and healthcare, are now well above pre-pandemic levels and continuing to grow. I don't know if your former president, Angela Pinsky, or William Floyd are on the phone, but they told me earlier this year that when Google shifted to allow its employees to live in any city where Google has a significant presence, that over 1,000 of them who lived elsewhere choose to move to New York City. And they now are at 12,000 New York City employees, highest they've ever been. They recently opened a new office building for 450 and are looking for more. So one important thing I think for us to see is it wasn't the Midtown corporate office buildings that drew people to want to live and work here. It's the culture, the food, the arts, the civic and intellectual life. In short, the benefits of a thriving, inclusive, multiracial democracy. And as we look at the challenges ahead in the economy, in our budget, in service delivery, for starters, we need a city that's economically generative, that one that people can afford to live in, and that provides for inclusive growth. And even as we see this shift to hybrid and remote work that I'll talk about in just a minute, and even as we face up to the challenges of inflation, of a likely economic downturn more broadly, and of expiring stimulus, there's real reason to believe that New York City remains a place that people want to be, that if we make the right investments, we can keep it that way, and that a thriving economy and an inclusive economy go together. So that does leave us with a really critical set of hard questions about the economic future of the city. I don't say any of that to say that we can be complacent, only that we can start to address hard questions with an optimism that we did not know if we would have in the darkest days of the pandemic. So obviously a big set of those questions are about the shifts in the geography of work. I'll show you some data that suggests that we are that remote and hybrid work are here to stay, that it's not about recovery from the pandemic anymore. That is a new model of how people are going to be working. That can go along with, it is going along with a thriving metropolitan economy, but it's got real impacts on office space in the central business district, on mass transit, and on the tax base that we have to face up to. We have these questions about what a more equitable economy and more equitable recovery looks like during those dark days of the pandemic. We talked frequently about how we saw the inequalities that the pandemic both revealed and exacerbated, and that we were going to do something about them on the other side. And here we are on the other side, unemployment for Black New Yorkers 4 times the national average and much higher than for others in New York City. Homelessness is rising, driven in part by high housing costs and in part by the arrival of asylum seekers from the southern border. How are we going to build an economy that is genuinely more inclusive? And how are we going to, in this age of accelerating anxiety and crises, be more ready for the future crises that many of which we can anticipate? The climate crisis that is not just coming, but already here, additional, pandemics and health issues, and just a wider range of other issues. So those seem to me like the big questions. I'm going to give you a little data and then offer a couple thoughts on what we can do to rise to those critical questions. So let me start by sharing some numbers, and I'm going to put up some slides here if I can share my screen. Oops, host disabled participant screen sharing. Thought we had this. If it's possible, Labney, to enable me to screen share. Beautiful, now I have it. Thank you, perfect. Share. All right, start the slideshow from the beginning. Beautiful, okay. All right, so every month, I hope you guys are on the distribution list. If not, our budget and finance and economics team put out a dynamite monthly economic newsletter, which has got a spotlight each month. And I'm going to talk to you about the last 2. For the August spotlight, we really looked at these return to office questions. And we looked at a set of surveys, some that the partnership had done about employers' expectations for the next 5 months, then a work from home research survey about employees' preferences. And then we also looked at the Castle data and the transit data on where things are. And I think there's a lot of reason to believe that, this average daily occupancy of office space of somewhere between 45 and 55% of pre-pandemic levels is where we're headed. That's of course concentrated, no surprise, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, with lower rates on Monday and Friday. But that the combination of some jobs shifting to all remote and other folks having 2 to 3 day in-office schedules, we're 3 days in the office, 2 days remote here in the controller's office. I know some of you are as well. Is the likely level at which we are, heading. And we'll see, one is foolish to make real long-term predictions at this moment in time, given the aperture of uncertainty, but I think it doesn't make sense with jobs, at 96% and occupancy, as you can see it at 40, in the 40s, to believe that what we're headed for anytime in the near future is office occupancies back at those levels. And that raises a whole series of questions at a lot of levels. So, mass transit is obviously a real big one. And you can see here by day of the week, you can see on the weekends, we're actually back at about 70%. And that while it's a little higher Tuesdays and Wednesdays, that midweek ridership is still a little bit below 60%. Of course, we need to keep offering a subway that gets those folks on time into and out of the office. But it raises a series of questions, and I really want to give Jano Lieber, the MTA chair and longtime ABNY friend, some credit. I think he's one of the public leaders that I've already heard starting in a compelling way to grapple with the future we're facing in 2 different ways. One, to look at the revenue questions. We've got a system that relies on fare box revenue. We are not going to be able to pay for the subway service we need with fare box revenues at these levels. And so there is going to have to be a question in Albany about other revenue streams, and whether that's, some kind of restored commuter tax or something like it's just straightforward. We can't run the system that we need on the fare box revenue that we've had. But it's also a question of thinking more creatively about where investments go. One of the things that Jano announced a couple of weeks ago is shifting the priorities for signal modernization, which is the critical infrastructure investment for a modern subway system, which had previously been proposed for on some of the Manhattan lines, which are currently running much more frequently, to some of the outer borough places where ridership is up. And I think we're just going to have to look at this more broadly. If we have an economy in which more people are making outer borough moves, then what kind of transit investments, what kind of new bus service, what kinds of other investments make sense? And we're just starting to get to those questions. Obviously, the federal infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act give us some opportunities here that we're really going to need to rise to. Another big question, at this moment in the economy, and I mentioned this before, and boy, you guys all know this as well, is about the housing affordability crisis and rising rents. And as Stephen mentioned, I've been working in housing. That's where I first met many of you when I was at the Fifth Avenue Committee and the Pratt Center, for the better part of 30 years. And we've always talked about it as a housing crisis. And yet, just look at this chart with median asking rents, above $3,500 citywide. In Manhattan, more like 5,000 with low vacancies. That's just not, that's a crisis that the city has to face up to. I'll talk a little more about my thoughts about what we need to be doing about it in a couple minutes, but the status quo is intolerable. I think these issues of housing, transit, and infrastructure all really make the case for what journalist Ezra Klein is calling liberalism that builds. While New York City doesn't have much influence on the macro economy, on what happens with inflation, we can and must do more to ensure that the construction and preservation of more housing, that our transit and energy and infrastructure investments, and the expansion of childcare and elder care, all of those things can create good jobs and lower the living costs for New Yorkers, addressing some of the issues that we're facing with inflation, building the city for the long term, confronting some of those challenges that we had before the pandemic, but that the pandemic has clearly exacerbated. And then, this chart is just adds to the last one. As you see, those spiking rents, of course, are related to spiking number of individuals in New York City's shelter system. This is both as a result of the increasing number of asylum seekers coming from the southern border, and while what Governors Abbott and DeSantis are doing is appalling human rights violation, and you can just see it's just sheer inhumane politics. It's also true that it's just a dynamite opportunity for New York City. If we want a growing city that grows and increases through immigration, as it has for its entire history, then this is our opportunity to step up, and that'll mean both opportunities for jobs and a need to address the housing crisis issues. I mentioned last month's Spotlight, which focused on the questions of the geography of work. I wanted to share as my last bit of kind of data about where the economy is, this month's Spotlight, which we just put out earlier this week, because it includes some really hopeful evidence that a more equal economy can also be a more thriving economy. We did some research that took a look at the economic effects of New York City's minimum wage increase. We had a minimum wage that was just a few short years ago with the rest of the country's at $7.25, and that between 2013 and 2019 grew to $15 an hour. So as a result of changes in state law. And of course, there was some anxiety about what the implications would be for the economy as a whole And the research that we did, which I have to say is just so encouraging, what it shows is, of course, for the households, as this chart shows, that got the minimum wage increases or were in industries with a high number of minimum wage jobs, like fast food and retail, that they saw big bumps in household income. What I think from Amni's point of view is just as important is that in those sectors, job growth and business creation was just as strong or stronger than in the 12 cities we looked at that did not raise their minimum wage during that time, and as in other occupations with fewer minimum wage workers. So what that is telling us, and this was even more pronounced in the outer boroughs than in Manhattan, where you saw an increase in the number of restaurants, this is pre-pandemic, but the restaurants and fast food establishments through this period of time, it is plausible to do something like raise a local minimum wage in a way that has enormous benefit to the lowest income folks, while still being entirely consistent with business startup and job creation. I think that's good news for New York City. And I think I'm happy to talk more about this in response to questions, but there's good evidence to believe that these local minimum wage increases are not inflationary, and that they don't affect business growth. So we can build a more equal and thriving and inclusive economy. The data really tells us that. So, okay, so that's a little about where we are and the economic challenges we're facing. I want to turn now to the governing challenges. How will New York City, in light of its own budget challenges and its own management challenges, show up to address these issues? We've obviously got to ground those questions in understanding better how demographic and migration patterns will affect the city's economy, the services that we need to provide, and the costs of providing them. And of course, we're already seeing those questions play out. I'll talk a little bit now about the city's budget and the challenges we're facing there. We ended fiscal year 22 in a really surprisingly strong place. Tax returns exceeded expectations, even leaving aside the federal funds, by about $6 billion. And as a result, we were able to make a significant contribution to the rainy day fund I'll talk about in just a minute. But we don't expect those good economic conditions, unfortunately, to continue, as I testified to last week at the Financial Control Board, as a result of stock market declines requiring greater contributions to our pension funds, as a result of the expired labor contracts and the need to renegotiate them, as a result of inflation and rising costs across the board, as a result of the expiration of federal stimulus dollars, and as a result of the likely economic downturn caused by the Fed's raising interest rates in order to quell inflation. The city is facing large out-year budget gaps, which grow to over $9 billion in both our estimation and the state controller's estimation by FY27. And we need to face up to that in serious and thoughtful ways. As Stephen mentioned, and as our office has focused on, a big chunk of doing that, of preparing for the city's next fiscal storm, is increasing deposits into and setting stronger formulas for the city's rainy day fund. We put this analysis out during the budget debate. We called for a total annual deposit last year of $2.5 billion. The mayor and the council deposited $2.2 billion, which was the biggest one-year deposit ever. So I do want to give them credit. There's more we can still do. We actually came in at the end of FY22, even after budget adoption in early June, about $800 million over plan. And we've called for that money to be contributed to the rainy day fund as well, as part of the November plan adjustment. So would love to see that. We also need a real formula here. It's not just an issue of debating it every year. This report, which is available on our website, lays out a really creative formula that Executive Deputy Controller Francesco Brindisi put forward of tying rainy day contributions to the growth in non-property tax revenues by the city, which fluctuate in an interesting way over time. And we believe can get us to, right now we're at about long-term reserves of 9.4% of tax revenues. We think that should grow to 16%, which is what would be necessary to get us through the full length of an average recession. And we're continuing to urge both the mayor and the council to adopt rules for both deposits and withdrawals. Obviously, another critical element, I don't have a PEG slide because the PEG is brand new. But we do agree, given all the factors that we've talked about so far, that a PEG program like the one that the mayor and the budget director announced this week is prudent. And I was encouraged to see them say to city agencies, this is about finding efficiencies. We need you to find savings without reducing services, so critical at this moment, and without layoffs. And we're going to do a PEG exercise in the controller's office. I'm glad every agency, that this applies to every city agency and does not exempt some and not others. I am concerned about one thing here, which is that the program also applies a hiring freeze until agencies' budget cut plans are approved. And I think, as a lot of you know, it does propose to exempt public safety and public health, but for example, it doesn't say anything about hiring at the Department of Housing Preservation Development, City Planning, and the Department of Buildings, where housing start applications are languishing for want of staff. This is not a moment. We don't need to impose a hiring freeze. There are a lot of city vacancies already. We will see savings as a result this year. Yes to the PEG program, but I really do think it's a mistake to implement a hiring freeze for all those reasons at this time. One other thing that I think is important to start looking at, and I mentioned this before in relationship to the subways and the possible need for something like a restored commuter tax, is an eye on regional tax base sharing. If income that previously would have been taxed in New York City is now going to be taxed in New Jersey or Connecticut as a result of work from home, we still have to keep New York City thriving as the anchor of the metro economy. But we may need to look at ways that revenues for the subways, that revenues for core services in New York City can be funded and financed, and would love your help thinking about that. Okay, so those are the challenges that the city budget is facing. Let me talk for a minute about what the things are that we want to be investing in, because our city needs both the funding but also the management capacity to deliver services that New Yorkers need. Like, what's first and foremost essential is getting the basics right so that all of you and the businesses in New York City can keep creating value. And that means getting the trash picked up, attracting families to our public schools, maintaining safe streets, all of that essential to the city's thriving. And as the city's chief accountability officer, that's a lot of what we're looking at. We did a round of town halls at the beginning of the year talking about trash, sanitation issues. I love seeing Jesse Tisch as the sanitation commissioner, really trying to step up and be more creative. I can't tell you how many times in low-income neighborhoods and high-income neighborhoods that it is about stepping on dog shit and having the trash piled up and seeing the rats. That's part of what people care about. We can do more just to get the basics right, and I'd like to see the investments there. Let's talk about public schools for a minute, which has obviously been a big source of debate over the summer. Obviously, we do need to do some real long-term planning here and ask questions about enrollment, which has been declining pre-pandemically, but declined even more so there. And there are a lot of shifts and dialogues we want to have about 3K, about class size, about meeting the needs of students with special needs. But I guess what I would say to you is, I don't know what is more important in the existential life of the city than preserving a public school system that people have confidence in. And that is true both as an opportunity creator for immigrants and low-income families, but it is so essential for middle-class families as well. If you're going to have those high housing prices that we looked at before, you have to know that 3K and pre-K and high-quality public education are going to be there for you. It's not just out of the goodness of our hearts. It's essential to our economic thriving. And that's why I felt really strongly about using a sum of the $4 billion in federal stimulus funds that are remaining for public schools specifically to address school budget cuts. So schools do not need to have to lay off music teachers and increase class size. And I think we're going to be having an increasing debate soon over this goal of universal 3K. And to me, that just seems like one of the things that is so essential for helping kids in disadvantaged families get a better head start, but also saying to middle-class families, the city's going to do things for you that you value and that save you money. We know you're spending more on rent, but you'll have 3K and pre-K that you wouldn't have elsewhere. And that is something that I think we can afford to do even while we make hard long-term choices about investments. Let's see, I'm running a little short on time because I want to leave room for questions. So I'm not going to talk too much about public safety here. If folks want to ask about it, I'm glad to come back to it. Obviously, there is a debate about how to achieve the levels of safety that everyone needs and deserve. What I will say is, I think there's some areas of very strong consensus, and I'll give you examples of two of them. How we respond to people with mental illness and mental health distress is just an issue that is, everybody agrees we've got to do better. I was out on Rikers a couple of weeks ago. We still allow it to be that Rikers Island is our biggest de facto mental health facility, even though for the 1,000 seriously mentally ill people there, we know they're getting worse and not better, and sometimes even committing suicide, and the folks who are on the street not getting care as well. So if we can step up our response to mental health care and on homelessness, we will be doing something that, again, really hits at that place of like what is necessary from a moral point of view, but what is equally necessary from an economic point of view. And then let's see, I want to talk about a few areas before I come toward the conclusion about where we are working to achieve more effective governance. Stephen mentioned this, obviously a big part of the job of the controller is to just be focused every day on making government work better. I'm proud in the first 8 months that we've got some really good things to show already. Right after the election, even before we came into office, I reached out to the mayor and said, we've got to do procurement reform. That's on the capital projects, that's in our human service nonprofits, that's for our MWBEs, that's across the board. I was therefore delighted when he appointed Lorraine Grillo as first deputy mayor because she's been such a good partner on infrastructure and capital projects. Sheena Wright and Ann Williams-Isom are also working very closely with us to get our nonprofits paid on time through this task force that you see up on the screen. Through the Clear the Backlog initiative, we've already unlocked nearly $5 billion in money that was owed to nonprofits for about a year. And there's just a whole bunch of like steps we can take to clear away the crud that makes our processes take so long. This gets back to that liberalism that builds frame, and we are really deeply committed to it here in the controller's office. I'm gonna stop the share now. And except that somehow that wiped away my whole screen. There we go. So to conclude and leave at least a little time for questions, I talked about how we see the state of the economy, and I talked about what city government needs to be able to do to show up. I want to end with some reflections on what I think the economic development strategy, that intersection of government and the business sector and the economy, can be focused on. And to me, it really seems like three big things: focusing on housing, and that means increasing supply, protecting tenants, and building more deeply affordable housing. I think a lot of you know from the Gowanus rezoning that I really tried to step up and say there can be a progressive view on how we create housing at all income levels while making sure we get the deeply affordable housing we need and tenants don't get displaced. We can achieve a deal that gets all three of those things. I hope we get a lot of the legislation that we need in Albany. I've been advocating, really leaning on a campaign for more equitable tax treatment both for homeowners in places like Southeast Queens and Staten Island, who are paying more in proportional property taxes than me and my neighbors in Brownstone, Brooklyn, and that's both inequitable, but not consistent with the long-term revenues and investments that we need. And we also need to address the multifamily rental issue, and we've put out a plan for that, for more equal tax treatment of new multifamily rental real estate that would basically cut rental tax rates for new development by about a third, and that we think addresses the issues that 421A was poorly addressing, will help actually make it much more possible to build rental housing, and will put us on a much sounder social footing. We'll have more to say about that as the fall moves forward. But what I hope we can see is that some program like that, that addresses the need to build, but that goes along with some legislation in Albany, like good cause eviction to better protect tenants, and that focuses on, what I often call social housing, that housing outside of the private marketplace, whether that's NYCHA or Mitchell Lamas, things like Co-op City and Penn South. If we can grow the spaces of the housing market that really do provide deeply affordable housing, I think that will help us persuade more New Yorkers that growth is in their interest. And then both the market and the social housing sector can be producing the affordability that we need. So that's the first big area, housing for our economic development. Second is infrastructure and climate. The infrastructure bill and the climate bill are such good opportunities for our city. We've got to capture all of those resources we can. We have to use them strategically. If we're smart, we can use the infrastructure bill, even though it's largely for road repaving, to help us confront the flooding issues that Ida has exposed. We've proposed something called Public Solar NYC, which could dramatically scale up rooftop solar in a partnership between the city and solar installers, and on and on and on. Getting infrastructure right is critical, both for the bones of our city and for the climate crisis. And then third, are investments in and expansions in the care economy. And I'm going to ask you guys, even if you haven't thought about that before, as core to the economy, the more we can do to expand and make childcare affordable, accessible, pay the folks who are doing it decent wages, that's just essential for the workforce. The more we can make sure we're taking care of our seniors and investing in our communities, that's what'll make it possible for our city to thrive. We don't always think of that as core. I showed you the data before that says raising the minimum wage from $7.25 to $15 an hour was good for the economy. And I guess I will say to you now that I think in the light of rising inflation, we have to do more for low-wage workers in and out of the care economy, that it's time to look at raising the minimum wage again, and that investments in lifting up and supporting care work is really a critical economic development strategy. Obviously, there's many other important sectors. We need your innovation in science and technology, in culture, in arts. But I think if we get housing, infrastructure, and the care economy right, that you guys will be able to create the new technology and life sciences businesses that fill up those vacant Midtown office spaces, that folks who are doing creative culture work will figure out what's the next thing, like Koreatown karaoke that fills up Midtown office spaces with culture work as well. And that the ways the city can then thrive don't come from government, that come from the sector of people creatively showing up and innovating and imagining, but in a city that they know it makes sense to live and work and thrive and invest in. There's no doubt these are challenging times. We'd be very foolish to pretend otherwise. Pandemic, war, climate change, inflation, they devastate families, they raise anxiety levels, they rattle markets and shake confidence in the future. But we can restore that confidence by telling the truth, by being honest with people, by delivering services effectively, by spending public funds wisely, by insisting on a more equal future and investing in the long term with clear eyes on the risks to come. I wish there were shortcuts, but I'm pretty sure there are not. But I do think the good news is we have a city, we have a community capable of focusing on the basics, investing in a more inclusive recovery, demanding an accountable city, and that those are the best ways to build a genuinely thriving New York City for the years and the decades ahead. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you. I look forward to your questions now. and to a dialogue with you in the years to come.
Thank you. That was terrific. Melba, I'm going to start with the toughest question on the Zoom. You're up.
Oh, I don't have the tough questions. That's Stephen, but I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Comptroller Lander. That was a really comprehensive sort of explanation on sort of the challenges that we face economically, and then sort of where we can do better, right? You talked about sort of the financial sort of reforms and things that can take place, and you put that up against sort of government reform and government management, which I think is really essential for a controller, but also for our city in this time of need. I also really want to thank you for your closing note about the contribution of the private sector. I mean, here at Abney, you know, we are a group made up of civically minded New Yorkers who, as Stephen always says, who are here to stay, and talking about sort of letting sort of the creativity of the private sector sort of work with government to address some of these challenges, I think is something that we love to hear. And I will say our Abney board member, William Floyd, is on the call, very good. And I'm sure he appreciates that shout out about Google. But again, that's just one example of sort of our network who's really here to participate and be a part of it. So, you know, basically, you made it very clear from your presentation that as New York City emerges from the pandemic, reviving the economy must be at the forefront. And you talked about a number of different ways we can do that, but really summing it up in strategic actions around housing, infrastructure, and then investment in the workforce. Specifically, you talked about the care economy, but I think, you know, overall, the workforce is really important. You know, we've all read the reports of gloom and doom of you know, the state budget officials, you know, recently announcing sort of the shortfalls for the years to come. You talked about sort of in the past how, you know, approximately 800 million of the year end, or, you know, that number has changed a little bit, how the excess that we have can be invested wisely to make sure that we sort of weather the storm. I'm really interested in sort of the practical steps in which you think we can go, the places of direct investment, short-term, mid-term, and long-term that you think the city really needs to do. I was in a meeting yesterday talking about the recovery of the city. You know, Dan Doctoroff talked about how we need to be bold in the strategic actions. Really interested in hearing from your perspective what those bold actions are, short-term, mid-term, long-term.
Yeah. Well, I'll start. I mean, I guess I gave some thoughts on housing, and I'm happy to talk more about that. But I do think, you know, the housing crisis has to be an impetus to us to invest more, and to, you know, and like the short term there is hiring up the staff that are needed at the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, City Planning, and the Department of Buildings to enable, you know, I feel so proud of the work in Gowanus, but if those projects can't move forward because folks can't get their permits approved, you know, then we are not addressing the housing crisis and we're not doing the job creation that we need. And so, like, let's hire up those staff. Let's get together and make the deal that's got to be made in Albany to better protect tenants and confront the tax treatment questions that I talked about. And then in the long term, let's, you know, keep fighting for more federal dollars and invest there, because as good as the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act are, they do not include a penny for public housing. And that's an example of the kinds of investments that we need from the federal government. On that topic, though, I do think the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act are such incredible economic development opportunities. It's just not every year that the federal government puts billions of dollars out there that our city desperately needs to modernize its infrastructure and invest in climate resiliency and our climate future. And those are tons of good jobs. And they're the investments that the city needs to be a place that thrives, where people aren't drowning in basements and where businesses have confidence to invest. So we're going to be pushing in my office, and I want to see City Hall. We just have not yet heard enough about, here's our strategy. Some of those dollars are by formula, but a lot of them are by competition. How are we going to get them? How are we using them strategically? I mentioned that the infrastructure bill is disproportionately road repaving, and road repaving is fine. But what we really need to do at the moment on our streets is address the sewer infrastructure under them. But those could be joint projects if you make sure that your DOT and DEP are working together. But that only happens if City Hall is really focused and insisting. And then a thing that Deputy Mayor Grillo is working on, and we're proud to be a partner, is making it possible to move those projects faster and at less absurd cost. There's a lot of capital projects management reform, and she's doing good work to lead on this along with Sharif Soliman, and we're part of a good task force, but we've got to drive forward on that. Yeah, let me stop there. There's a million other things we could talk about, but those are two that I just think are big opportunities at the moment.
Thank you.
Can I dig a little bit more on housing? You're obviously successful in Gowanus, markedly different against, let's say, certain other rezonings like Frog's Neck or Industry City that haven't been successful. We're in a city where the middle class is also being pushed out, and affordability at lots of levels exist, which our research has shown us it's just bad long term for the cities of teachers, doctors, even like lots of people can't live here. How do we actually do better in this? Because I think we've set up a system where people kind of hate the real estate industry, but yet want them to build, but that's not that it is their job to, but then they come to build and they say, well, and no one's happy because nobody wants a new building on their block. Like, I think we have this system where everybody kind of hates each other. And how do you practically get around that?
Yeah, this is the trillion-dollar question for New York City, but really for the country as a whole. And a lot of valuable stuff is being debated. I'll give my perspective because I really Twitter just drives me so crazy here, as though the set of people who care about housing is divided into kind of a YIMBY camp of people who believe the market will solve the problem. We got to unfetter development and let it happen and kind of roll over NIMBY resistance. And there's plenty to that perspective. And then a set of people who are like, but tenants need protections and owners are throwing them out and we need stronger tenant protections. And I hate developers. And, I understand that perspective too, but it just is. And I want to, you mentioned a couple of places where things fail, but this week, Tiffany Caban got to yes on a new project in Astoria. In some ways, and I feel like it uses the Gowanus model. So I'll suggest a couple of things. One, we laid out a plan when I was in the council for a more, and I think people fear the words comprehensive planning. So I'm open to saying something more like strategic land use planning, if that will help. But we have to make the goal of shared and inclusive growth a city goal, not something that a developer claims was what was motivating their individual project. Because once you're having the project debate, you're kind of stuck with yes, it's a developer who's motivated by making money, and it's a community that often doesn't want that growth nearby. We need to start from saying there is broad consensus that we need more housing construction across the city, in all our neighborhoods, but obviously targeted to places where infrastructure will support it, or we can make infrastructure investments to do it, at a wide range of income levels. And if we said something like that first and made it policy, and the council adopted a plan of that kind with guidance from city planning, then I think it's a lot harder for members to vote against projects that advance those goals that they said they had collectively. And there are cities, we put a proposal called Planning Together forward in the council. It's still on the council website and we can circulate. I'm open to other ideas for it, but I really think we're not going to get out of this thing we're stuck in without something like that. To your point about middle-class New Yorkers, one thing that just seems so obvious to me is that we need something, a 21st century of the Mitchell-Lama program. Everyone's always saying it, but we still aren't doing it. We need a multifamily affordable homeownership program. It would be so much easier to go talk to people about growth in their neighborhood if they thought what was going to be created was something like that, where they and their neighbors would benefit. And what we still need a lot of rental housing. So I'm not saying that there shouldn't be rental housing, but if we had something like that, we're not going to be able to, I don't think, create adequate homeownership opportunities for working and middle-class families just by hoping people will be able to afford to buy the existing 1 to 4 family housing stock. So, and what a great way to propose density with some kind of 21st century, Mitchell-Lama multifamily affordable co-op program. That just seems like another place we could get a lot of consensus.
We look forward to you proposing a Mitchell-Lama-like program in the future.
We'll be doing it.
Yeah. So Stephen, I'll jump in. Well, thank you, Stephen, for raising the question about middle class, and Comptroller, about your response, and especially highlighting the issues with the current property tax system, and for your support on sort of fixing that system. It's not a question, that's more of a statement. But I just wanted to get to some of the audience questions. Something that we haven't talked much about was homelessness. And there's a question about the Department of Homeless Services, and it expects to proceed through the PEG. How will the Comptroller's Office view the PEGs against the demand for this particular agency? And something we always like to ask, and with this, how can ABNY members help?
Yeah, that is great. And I love that it's raised as a question in that way, you know, and there was this kind of hiccup this week where the right to shelter was sort of called into question. And I think after a little bit of back and forth, that both the governor and the mayor, you know, reflected an understanding that we have this constitutional right to shelter. What a great thing to have. Like, is it expensive to provide shelter to people and help them get on their way to permanent housing? It turns out it is expensive. What a great thing to live in a city that says that's who we're going to be and what we're going to do. And like, it's a settled debate. It's a matter of New York State Constitution. I feel proud of it. And like, if then ABNY and everybody steps up together and says, how are we going to do it? How are we going to, it's great that these, I mean, it's horrid the way that Abbott and DeSantis are treating these folks, but growth through immigration is what saved the city, you know, coming out of the fiscal crisis. We're lucky to have these folks coming. They want to work. Let's push the federal government, as the mayor is doing rightly, to give work authorizations. Let's think about how we help those folks get into good jobs as quickly as they can, whether they're coming from Venezuela or coming from Ukraine. That's a set of folks who, like, let's make sure they have shelter when they get here. And yes, that's going to mean more money. I mean, the Department of Homeless Services needs to explore whether, you know, it's got a peg target like everybody else, and they're going to have to look at things they've been doing a long time and see if there are ways to achieve cost savings. But we're going to spend more money this coming year than we did last year, and probably more the year after that, to have a bigger, like the number of homeless folks in the homeless system is growing, and that's going to mean, you know, either taking more hotel space or opening more shelters. But then let's say, all right, that's a lot of folks who want pathway to jobs. Let's get the federal government to give them work authorizations and help folks get into those jobs. Again, if we could be using the infrastructure money to start more construction projects and install more solar panels on tops of buildings and expand care work, like those are great jobs for people to get. And yeah, like, let's use it to make sure we push forward on affordable housing. Yes, to middle class and working class home ownership, but yes, also to deeply affordable housing that helps folks get out of the shelter system. And all of those things are going to have to be a partnership between the public sector, the nonprofit sector, and the private sector. You know, on the nonprofit side, I'm grateful. I know a lot of ABNY folks are board members of nonprofits. And I've heard from a lot of you about getting the nonprofits paid on time. Let's not forget that the very same folks were asking to open up that center for migrants or provide resources to help folks get to work or their kids get to school. We're making wait a year to get paid. And like, no one in the private sector thinks it's okay to wait a year to pay the people for work that they did. And no one in the public sector, we couldn't ask our firefighters or teachers or police officers, hey, keep the school running. And maybe, you know, 10, 11, 12, 14 months from now, we'll get around to paying you. So let's get that done. One last thing on homelessness that we're going to do some more work exploring. I do think we need to look at housing first approaches in New York City, which we just have not had as much in the past. We've taken a provide the right to shelter and then build supportive and affordable housing. And yes to all of that for sure. But I think we're seeing the success some other places like Houston and other places of helping folks go straight from the street into supported kinds of housing environments with good results. And I do think that's one thing we need to add to our toolkit.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that.
How do we balance, like, let's just take two priorities. You mentioned earlier that there are 4 times the rate of unemployment in the Black community than there is on a national basis. And you have 10,000 people having just been transported to the city in the last 2 months by Governor Abbott. I guess I'd ask the question is, do we have enough money to address both those issues well at this point in time? And I think, like in government, you're forced to make choices. Like, how do you do that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and so a few things. First, I appreciate it. And I know there was some ABNY members. I can't remember now. It was earlier this week or last week with the mayor when he announced the career and technical education and job and internship expansion. What a good model. There's no doubt that a part of what we need to be focused on in a big way in our public schools is more of those kinds of partnerships. And there are just so many opportunities there, a lot of which don't even really cost additional money. It's about using school time. If people have not visited the new high school in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which works with 8 other Brooklyn high schools and helps kids connect to the kinds of jobs and businesses that are being created and growing in the Navy Yard. It's just like a great model of what makes public education work to help folks get access to jobs. So there are things that, and I'll use this public solar NYC program that we're pitching as a model. What we want to do is use basically city capital dollars or municipal debt to finance city-built rooftop solar. So we'll pay for it. Of course, we're going to hire installers to do the work. We're not going to have a city workforce that does it. But if we're paying for it, we can say to those installers, you need to hire people through the set of programs that Green City Forest and Solar One and St. Nick's are running that give a pathway to people in public housing and frontline environmental justice communities to those jobs. And I actually think that we could do without a meaningful infusion of city expense dollars at all. If we were to use city capital, it is infrastructure. We can own the rooftop solar, even if it's on private homes and buildings, and create a ton of good jobs. And those jobs would be perfect for folks coming from Venezuela, for folks coming from Ukraine, for kids coming out of high school whose families have been in New York City in low-income neighborhoods for a long time. So that, and again, ABNY folks are creating those kinds of opportunities as well. That doesn't eliminate the hard choices. Like, budgeting is hard choices, and you have to figure out what can we afford to do. If there's things we're obligated to afford to do that we're going to need some additional revenue for, what are the ways of achieving that? I gave one example in the talk that I just don't see how we're going to be able to keep mass transit investments without some additional public revenue. Seems to me straightforward that should come from something like a commuter tax because it's a regional system. But look, part of why I think property tax reform is essential because we have an unfair system now. It's essential because we overtax new rental real estate and we're not going to get the rental housing we need. But it also is, if your system is so broken and inequitable that you could never contemplate using it to raise additional revenue, even if you thought what was needed was to make more investments in your city's long-term future, that is not a safe way to run a city. And part of kind of getting the basics right is to ask the hard questions about where you have to prioritize, but also to be ready to think about where you might need additional investments down the road.
All right, since it's 11 and Melva is a stickler on time for me, I'm going to say, Comptroller, thank you. This is fascinating. I hope this is the beginning of a conversation of partnership between us because, in fairness, we've got a lot of other questions. We want to talk more. I think maybe if we could do something in person down the line, we'd be grateful. And I just want to say how grateful we are for your public service and how we hope we have lots of opportunities to work with you. Melva,
thank you so much. I'm delighted. I'm eager to come back. I will also say, if folks have ideas or questions, you don't have to wait till the next time I come to ABNY. Please do feel free to reach out to our office, get on that list for our economic briefing, but reach out with ideas and proposals. We're all fall going to be reaching out to folks across the different sectors of the city's economy to talk more about some of these ideas and what else you think we would be doing. And we really, really appreciate the conversation.
I appreciate, thank you for that offer. And for all those who put questions in the Q&A function and we didn't get to them, please use this opportunity to reach out to the Comptroller's office. If we need to help facilitate that for you, just let us know. Again, thank you so much, Comptroller Lander. We look forward to hosting you again in the near future. And thank you, ABNY members, for joining us this morning for this special briefing with Comptroller Lander. Thank you.
Thanks so much.